This week, of all the chapters that we've discussed so far, and that we will continue to discuss through the rest of the term, this chapter may be the one that has possibly the most impact on all of you in terms of the pain that, quite frankly, that is created in our culture through our bodies, through the way we look, how we think we look, how we think we should look. There's other aspects in this chapter that have to do with our health as well. Gender, our bodies, and our health is the title of the chapter. But I think a lot of it, uh, and our health, of course, is crucial as well. And so it addresses such issues as, how dangerous masculinity can be in our culture, and what happened with childbirth and hormone replacement therapy, those types of things. How did all of that come to be, and the problems associated with all of those areas? So let's get started. I think it will be an eye opener to you. I'm sure you've read the chapter, but um, I've got some other examples and things that were in the chapter. So the first question in the chapter is, does gender play a part in what happens to our bodies? And what else, affects the amount of power that we have over our own bodies? The gender is one, and it's a huge one, but there are other elements as well that have an effect on the power we have over our own bodies. Laws are an example, right? And we're seeing that play out at the very moment that we're speaking, how various laws and legislation can affect what happens to our bodies. So there's an awful lot to explore, as you can see, in relation to gender in the body. And bodies can be, and they often are, the ground where battles take place. And then once again, I mean, it couldn't be more relevant to what's happening today to have this discussion. And another example is in the case of intersex people, as we've seen in a previous chapter, the bodies are often a place where autonomy is lost. The autonomy means control, right? And in autonomy, control over yourself, and obviously over your own bodies. That control is lost in a lot of spheres as well, the ones we just mentioned of childbirth and a variety of other things. So, but in the case of intersex people, it's a huge issue. So, because their bodies are often a place where autonomy is lost, as I said, and so are infant males with circumcision. There's no choice there, is there? That's just what something is done to their bodies. And then there's female genital mutilation as well, which is common in many African countries, and I'll put up some information about it for you. And then, childbirth. I keep mentioning that, but I'll explain why as we get into that part, is another area where often women's autonomy is lost. So we're going to first explore a brief history of bodies uh, in the developed world. Okay, so, and what's very, I don't know if it's unique. It was unique when it first came about in a sense, but this idea are very strong, I would say, in developed countries. This is what's called the mind-body dualism. And it's one of the very basic fundamental ideas in Western thought. And it's demonstrated by sayings like, you've heard this before, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So the spirit represents the mind. The flesh represents the body. Which is the higher road there to take? It's obviously spirit. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay, so that's the concept, a really basic concept of mind-body dualism. And that goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, as your book points out. It's a very ancient saying. So the spirit represents our higher selves, that to which we aspire. And the body is the force preventing us through weakness from achieving those higher goals in the mind-body dualism construct. And it's very old, as I just said, in Anglo-European cultures. So it's important to the specific issue of gender because it also has its own gender dynamic, which is the mind is associated with masculinity. It's rational, right? It guides us to our highest goals. It's closer to God in this concept. And it works, that works us towards self-realization. So that's the mind associated with masculinity. The body, on the other hand, is feminine, and it drags down all the aspirations of the mind to be higher. So no one knows for sure which came first, the mind-body dualism or the male-female dualism. And there are, as you might imagine, many, many philosophical opinions and academic writings about this issue, which came first. Now, there's a book that your text mentions. We're going to talk about it here, but I want to highly recommend it to you. It's a fantastic book, and it's called The Mermaid and the Minotaur. The Minotaur was the bull that was in the maze, and the maidens were thrown, put in the maze, and then the Minotaur would get them and kill them. Okay. So Dorothy Dinnerstein is the author of The Mermaid and the Minotaur, and she believed that the gendered concept of mind-body dualism can be traced to women's primary responsibility for taking care of infants and human bodies. So we became associated with bodies, the mind-body dualism, because we had so much to do with bodies, from giving birth to bodies to then taking care of those bodies as they grew, and that sort of thing. So however it originated, mind-body dualism means that there's a certain negativity that's associated with female bodies, with women, and with femininity. Because like the body, women came to represent, and this is a quote, the distraction from knowledge, seduction away from God, giving in to sexual desire, violence or aggression, failure of will, and even death, end quote. Okay, so needless to point out, that's a lot of baggage to carry around as a female. And I would say as a male as well, this dualism positions women more, as more closely associated with their bodies, their own bodies, than men. And that raises a question about bodies in the second wave of feminism. How did, that second wave that started in the 60s, what was the thinking there? So one important aspect is the connection to sexuality, of course, because some societies view women as hypersexual, oversexed beings. And they're temptresses, whose bodies are made to lead men away from spiritual and intellectual pursuits. You'll see a lot of that in ancient Greek myths. And of course, as your text points out, the Adam and Eve story is a perfect example of that. So another way that gender and bodies intersect that affects women much more is body image. And I'm sure as females, those of us who are identify as female are, that gendered, can really relate to this idea of body image, the perception and evaluation of one's own bodily appearance. Body image, of course, has been shown to be connected to self-esteem and emotional stability, which shows the way, that's if you have a good body image, right? Which shows the way that our bodies can have important effects on the state of our minds. And that's why I said in the beginning that this is such an important chapter, because so much pain is caused by things like body image. And we'll get into some statistics about that further in. So, of course, There's, nothing new. It's not unique to Western cultures either by any means. All over the world, bodies reflect a person's status in their society and present to very important identities. Just the snap decision, it's only, if you've taken a speech class, it's only a few seconds and you don't have to say anything before people make assumptions about who and what you are. But here's another example of a cross-cultural thing about beauty and ideas about beauty, concepts of it. In Nigeria, for example, uh, the way that a person presents their identity through body image in many cases is through creating beautiful designs through scarification on their bodies. And the tattoos and other forms of scarification tell stories about gender and age. And the reason for age is that many women only receive scars after puberty. So it's part of the puberty ritual. So right away, if you see someone who's got scars, it's after puberty. If it's someone who does not yet in this Nigerian culture, then they have not reached puberty yet. And they can also tell a person's lineage. So, but what do the absence of scars or imperfections on a person tell us in the United States? Well, first of all, generally it has to do with social class, okay? A face without scars or other imperfections in the US is a good sign, usually is a good sign of social class, because surgeries to move scars are quite expensive, okay? And of course, as you might imagine, women are much more likely to be concerned about scars or blemishes on their faces than men are, because in men, they could be interpreted as, quote, rugged. So obviously then, something like scars tell us something different if you're in Nigeria than if you're in the US. But both cases are an example that show us how the body can be an important marker of social status. Now, what about a person in the US who can't avoid having scars? Well, because of our emphasis on bodily perfection, here's a key point. It affects the way a person thinks about themselves. And now we're going to spend some time really digging deeply into that, how body image affects the way we think about ourselves. That's where a lot of the pain that I've referred to several times comes in. So The Beauty Myth is another amazing book by Naomi Wolf. And the subtitle of The Beauty Myth is How Images of Beauty Are Used Against Women. So feminists point out that one of the primary ways to maintain the power imbalance between men and women is through ideals of beauty. And this observation and concern dates way, way back into the very first writings by women about gender inequality. So Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the most famous women one of the very first writers and speakers about the inequality between men and women. And in 1792, she wrote about the important role of beauty in women's subordination in her famous essay, and this is the title of the essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Here's a brief quote. Genteel women are, literally speaking, slaves to their bodies and glory in their subjugation. Now, to move forward a bit from that time period, the 1700s, in 1914, one of the rights listed on the agenda for the first feminist mass meeting was, quote, the right to ignore fashion. I love that. That's a great one. So during the second wave of feminism, there again in the 60s, there was a protest of the Miss America contest. I remember that so well, partly because of the ways that it enforces certain beauty ideals for women, which are, of course, unattainable for the vast majority of women. So Naomi's book, The Beauty Myth, catalogs the ways in which cultural ideals of beauty create a very unrealistic standard, impossible for most women to achieve. I want to remind you that the images you see are usually airbrushed or manipulated in, well, airbrushing's ancient technology. It's much easier to do on the internet now. They're morphed and changed. Legs are made much longer, waists are made tinier, breasts are made bigger, etc. Hair is made fuller. They're manipulated images, is my point, the vast majority of them. So, what exactly is the beauty myth? What did Naomi Wolf mean by that term that she coined? It's the belief in a quality called, quote, beauty that is real and universal and that women should want to embody and that men desire. Well, I'm sure you're aware of this. There is no universal definition of beauty across cultures. But anyway, so Wolf's goal is to show that all of these ideas, as I just gave you one example, are part of a myth and are therefore not actually true. Which means if there is no real universal measure of beauty, because it's different in different cultures and in different historical times, and because different cultures also have very different contradictory ideas about what beauty is. In addition, of course, there's no biological reason for women to pursue beauty ideals. They do so because the culture reinforces and rewards it. So even if not true, it really doesn't matter. It's good to know that, but the fact is that the beauty myth is such a powerful force in keeping women focused on the pursuit of beauty and providing a way for both men and women to judge and limit women by their physical appearance. In other words, according to Wolf, beauty is this is a key point, politically and economically determined and is, quote from the book, the last best system to keep dominance intact. As proof of this, since the second wave of feminism, the beauty myth has become even more powerful as a kind of backlash to women's gains in power. So it's become even more prevalent, this idea of how you look. And as I said, with, computer technology, you can make anybody look like anything, of course. And so it affects us even more today than it did in the past, even though we supposedly know more. So let's look at beauty and gender inequality. Does the beauty myth affect men and women the same way? Well, no, they're different ways, but they're interesting to pick apart here and look at them in deeper. So an important way that the beauty myth contributes to male dominance is by channeling a lot of women's energies to the pursuit of beauty. A lot of time, a lot of energy, sometimes a lot of money, sometimes a lot of pain, right? When one could be, putting that into a career or being an artist or a writer or, something else. And of course, many of those attempts in the ways I just mentioned, whether it's binging and purging, starving yourself, being anorexic, surgery, whatever, many of them fail. They're bound to fail to one degree or another because there is no real objective and universal ideal of beauty. And therefore, this pursuit of it takes a psychic and emotional toll on many women. Research shows that most women, are much less satisfied with their bodies than men's are, as one might expect, because there are much higher ideals for women's bodies than there are for men's. And in addition, the rates of satisfaction with both men and women are increasing over time. These statistics are pretty interesting here. In 1985, for example, 30% of women in the US said they were unhappy with their overall appearance. By 1993, it had increased to 48%. That's nearly 1 in 2, obviously. But by 2018, and remember what I said about technology and manipulation of images, by 2018, a whopping 83% of women were dissatisfied compared to 74% of men, which is pretty damn high too. A more recent study revealed that 89% of American women are unhappy with their weight. 39%, so almost 40%, say that worrying about their weight interferes with their happiness. Now, remember what I said about manipulating images again, okay? Because if you are trying to look like something that isn't really attainable by the vast majority of human female bodies, you're going to fail, right? So the first thing to understand as we get more into what ideal bodies are supposed to look like and have over history. The first thing I want you to understand is that you need 20 to 25% body fat to ovulate. Okay? Get pregnant, if that's what you want to do as an adult, woman, you need to have that much body fat, 20 to 25%, to menstruate and to ovulate. So let's just start with that, and then we'll think about skinniness. So why are women becoming increasingly dissatisfied with their bodies? And that's because ideals about how the perfect woman should look, they're always changing according to culture. And I put up a bunch of photos for you to see as the description here in the text, which I'm going to talk about here, so you can see them visually. Okay, so the clinched waist ideal of the 1900s was one. Now, going back before the 1900s a little bit to Scarlett O'Hara, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, that famous movie, there's a scene where she's getting ready for a ball, and she's getting dressed, and her slave is helping her get dressed. Scarlett, is holding on to a tall bedpost, a canopy bed, while her slave cinches her into this waist cincher, and she's pulling against the bed post because the slave is pulling so hard to tighten the cinch to hopefully attain an 18-inch waist before she gets into her dress to go to the ball. Okay, so we've got this from the cinched waist of the 1900s and a bit earlier to the flat-chested flapper of the 1920s to the large-breasted hourglass figure of the 1950s. I put up Jane Russell for you, the actress who was the epitome of that look, to the heroin chic of the mid-1990s, and there's a photo of that too, and to the full-breasted but very skinny supermodels of today. The body type most commonly depicted in today's culture, that full-breasted, very skinny, very tall look, is one attainable by about only 4% of the female population. These models, today's models, are an average of 9% taller and 16% thinner than the average woman. So there's no amount of dieting and exercise that will create that body type for 96% of women. Okay? You certainly are not going to add 9% of height to yourself through any process. So, yet, these images, they're the images that both, and this is important, both men and women are bombarded with daily. Interesting stat, more than half of Vogue's readers are size 14 or larger, but most of the models in Vogue are size 6 or smaller. So out of all this emerged what's called the body positivity movement. It's a fairly recent movement. And the body positivity movement advocates for the acceptance of our bodies regardless of size, shape, skin, and other people's bodies too, regardless of size, shape, skin tone, gender, or physical abilities. Although there's never been one just one dominant ideal of beauty in the US. Dominant ideals always compete with the ideals of specific racial, ethnic, or class subcultures as well. But of course, it's the dominant ideals of the mega culture, which, the numerically is not as great as it used to be, the white culture, but it is certainly the most powerful in terms of media and images and things. So because of those ideals that they have are legitimized through popular culture, they're the ones that predominate. And in this dominant ideal to be beautiful, you must also be white or light-skinned, able-bodied, and young. Well, that lets out an awful lot of people. Women with disabilities, for instance, are rarely held up as images of beauty. So how does the beauty myth, we always look at the cross-cultural things in each chapter that we're studying. How did the beauty myth and how does it get exported? Okay. Because that ideal of thinness has begun to spread globally. And here's an example. In 2001, a Nigerian woman won the Miss World contest after the producer for the Nigerian country contest was told by the judges to pick someone based on international beauty standards rather than Nigerian standards of beauty. Why? What's the difference between the two? Well, the ideal body shape for women in Nigeria is voluptuousness. It's the Jane Russell look, which if you look at the photos, you'll see what that looks like. Full breasts and full hips. And the one they chose for the Miss World contest was 6 feet tall and skinny, not the model, the idea of beauty in Nigeria. So they picked an anomaly, a woman who was an anomaly from the country contest, beauty contest, to send to the Miss World contest to compete. But the Nigerians didn't think that this woman, particularly the ones over 40, was particularly attractive because she was nothing like what the ideal of beauty was in Nigeria. But since then, of course, since she won, and then Western media images and ideals of feminine beauty, they've begun to change that in Nigeria and other places. Brazil is an example. A similar transition is taking place in Brazil. Historically, the ideal female body was guitar-shaped, was the ideal. Ample waist, hips, and bottom. But the Brazilian supermodel, Gisele Bündchen, you may know her, her face and body is everywhere, is tall, thin, and busty. So she's just the opposite of guitar-shaped, where all the voluptuousness and waist is from the waist down, kind of. So young Brazilian girls used to have a doll called Susie, whose body reflected Brazilian norms, just like our Barbie reflects our idea of beauty. She was darker skinned than Barbie, as well as fleshier in the waist, hips, and bottom. But Barbie arrived in Brazil by the mid-1980s, and production of the Susie doll ended. And that left Brazilian girls with the blonde, skinny, big-breasted Barbie as the image of beauty. If you don't know this, I want to let you know that Barbie's body is an impossibility in a real body. She's so tall and so full-breasted and so skinny that she would fall forward. You can look this up. There's all kinds of articles written about, academic articles written about the impossibility of a Barbie body to really, in real life. So the cultural shift in norms has had its consequences in Brazil, because the percent of the population who taking appetite suppressants in Brazil nearly doubled between 2001 and 2005, and led to the death of 6 young women in 2007. But cultural norms that worship thinness are, as you know, important contributors to the prevalence of a wide range of eating disorders and anorexia, like anorexia and bulimia in the United States. Men who suffer from these disorders, this is interesting, They tend to be in activities or professions that involve very rigid weight requirements, men who are anorexic and bulimic, such as dancing, modeling, and wrestling. Now, what about cosmetic surgery? That's very prevalent, as you know, and it's a more extreme step, obviously, in the alteration of one's body. And those who choose to have cosmetic surgery um, have placed so much importance on appearance that sometimes they even put their lives at risk depending on the type of surgery that they have. Um, there used to be kind of a stigma about cosmetic surgery, but that's fading as increasing numbers of women and some men are choosing to do it. So plastic surgeons performed more than 17.7 million aesthetic procedures in 2018. And that's up dramatically than the previous year. The most common plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery is breast enlargement. And there were 13,000 more of them performed in 2018 than in 2017. So that's an enormous increase in 1 year. Liposuction is the second most common. And it's not surprising that 92% of cosmetic surgeries are performed on women. So another important point about cosmetic surgery is although it's improved over time, it's still a surgical procedure. And any surgical procedure has risks. The third most important type of cosmetic surgery in the US is blepharoplasty, and that's eyelid surgery. And was performed on 206,000 patients in 2018, and 85% of them were women. That eyelid surgery is marketed as reversing the signs of aging and fatigue, and by removing what's called a droopy eyelid look and bags under the eyes. Because part of the beauty ideal in the US is, of course, looking eternally young. However, there's a specific type of blepharoplasty called double eyelid surgery or Asian blepharoplasty. What's that? Well, as you know, many of people with Asian ancestry are born with eyelids that are single-lidded rather than double-lidded. And that makes them look, quote, different, right, from what is considered, quote, normal in the United States. It's important to point out, however, that 1 in 4 people on the planet are Chinese or are of Chinese ancestry. So that means that huge shares of the world's population are single-lidded. And this doesn't count Asians of other ancestry that are also, for the most part, single-lidded. In the US, however, whiteness is an important way of defining the norm. So therefore, double eyelids are perceived as the norm or normal and as desirable by many Asian women. But it's interesting when research was done speaking to Asian women about having double eyelid surgery, why they had it. It wasn't because they were ashamed of being Asian. It was because they were proud, actually, to be Asian American. They did not necessarily want to look, quote, white. But instead, because of the negative connotations of the facial features associated with many Asian faces by whites, they decided to have the surgery. So what is cosmetic surgery? That was one example. Well, we talked about the top 3, so 3 examples. There are lots of kinds, and there are some that you may not know about or have thought about. And one is female genital mutilation, which I mentioned earlier, and I put up some information about it in this week. It's most common in western, eastern, and northern regions of Africa. So Early feminist research and thought explored the relationship between gender and bodies, and the body was considered by those earlier waves of feminism to be a tool of the patriarchy. It was a way to control women, basically. That was what they meant by a tool of the patriarchy. But as feminist critiques evolved over the different waves of feminism, some began to argue that the pursuit of beauty could, in some ways, be considered a means of empowerment. This is very interesting to think about. Uh, that it could be a means of empowerment for women then rather than just a primary tool of their oppression. And more recently, LGBTQ people have begun to redefine what beauty means and how it relates to power, as well as the connections between beauty and gender. So David Yee, in his book Pretty Boys, this chapter refers to that. He looks at masculine beauty through time. And he found out some very interesting things. He found that most beauty practices have been used by men at some point in history, as well as women. And here's a great example. In 1300 BCE, Babylonian warriors spent hours in their equivalent of a beauty salon before going to battle. They had their hair curled, and the Babylonians had very elaborate hair styles, both the men and the women. So they had their hair curled and cut, as well as getting manicures and pedicures, because the belief was, quote from the book, if you're going to die, you might as well look good. So there's an example of very, very masculine men uh, getting involved in a beauty process. So starting in as early as the 18th century, during the Enlightenment period, there was a period in time and different periods when it was okay for men to be concerned about beauty and go through procedures and that type of thing. But around the 18th century, the Enlightenment period, anything associated with women and femininity, like enhancing your appearance through beauty routines, was seen as weak and therefore not for men, the smarter and stronger sex, right? And then, of course, along comes capitalism in the form of the beauty industry, and which was and is, of course, very influential in associating femininity and beauty. This great Elizabeth Arden slogan during World War II was, quote, if you're not wearing makeup, you're not patriotic. So David Yee, in the Pretty Boy book, argues that this association between makeup and femininity is changing and that Gen Z is in the forefront of the transformation. He was called a pretty boy when growing up. And what he says is he emphasizes that outside the binary, beauty is a way of expressing authenticity and therefore a form of empowerment as it was in the past. And I want to add something in here for you. One of the most amazing phenomena of the 1960s movement, countercultural movement, and you can go look at some photos of this or films, is that men were allowed to be beautiful. They grew their hair, they wore amazing clothes. They were allowed to express their beauty. Nobody thought they were effeminate for doing that. So go back, look at Monterey Pop or Woodstock or something, and you'll see some of what I'm talking about with the men. And women loved it. It was so refreshing to see men express themselves with their appearance and the colors, the clothing that they wore, that type of thing. So there, I'm done raving about that. But nobody talks about that I've seen and as part of the 60s, and it was really something. So now we're going to move on to men and body image. In the U.S., the mind-body dualism, that separation between the mind and the body, often handicaps women in relation to their bodies. And because we're all body, men are all mind, right? And until recently, that wasn't true for men, but many of those pressures about body appearance are changing, and they also have some equivalence among men. Worldwide, male bodies are also used as markers of gender, status, and group membership. Think about the Nazis, and think about how, for instance, circumcision could have life and death consequences. Male circumcision, for people of Jewish identity, and it's historically been an important marker of Jewish identity. So it's marked on your body. That's what they mean as an example of markers of gender status and group membership. It's clear that both gender and other kinds of status are inscribed on men's bodies as well as women's, and not just from that example, but there are important differences as well in the ways that they are and in the meanings that they have. So in issues of body image, eating disorders, and the beauty myth, men and masculine identifying people often have lifetime struggles with being overweight or underweight or too skinny to be considered masculine, which may be the more common form. And they have their own unique issues in relation to their bodies. Because even though that mind-body dualism equates masculinity with the mind, they still, all of them have physical bodies. And so how does the mind-body dualism affect men around that issue in their bodies that's different than the way it affects women? So part of this is that even though there's different norms of appearance and physical attractiveness based on gender, and the way people react to us are very important into how we feel about ourselves. So for those considered to be more physically attractive, and this is regardless of their gender, people who are considered to be more physically attractive, however their gender presents, are also thought to have more socially desirable personalities and are assumed to lead happier lives. For those considered to be attractive, in addition, people generally show more affection, expect more of them, and endow them with many positive qualities, which, of course, all of those things create what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the result is that people who are considered attractive actually do tend to be more competent socially and successful because they're treated as though they are, and they respond that way. One example is the importance of being tall if you're a man. So, obviously that's different for men and for women. Height for men can be an especially important component of attractiveness. It's considered very important in Anglo-European cultures like the U.S. Here's an example. The taller of the two in politics and the presidency, the taller of the two major party candidates always or almost always wins. Ever since the advent of the televised presidential debate, and the great majority of our presidents in more current era, when people grew taller, have been at least 6 feet tall, most of them a little bit over 6 feet tall. Based on research, taller men are more likely to be trusted. They're hired and promoted more often. Height is also seen as leadership potential. And there we get to the presidents again. And it's a consistent marker of status and rank across many cultures. So if height indicates power and status, it can only follow that in heterosexual couples, the man should be taller than the partner. So I was searching for videos and I found one. I can't put it up because of the language, but these were college students, and there were 3 young men. It was a class project, I believe, interviewing 3 young women about this very issue. And one of them asking them, would you ever go out with date a man who is shorter than you? And one of them responded with such disgust, and that's where the language got pretty bad, that she would never do that. And she didn't even want to talk about it anymore at one point. And I wish I could put it up for you, but you can Google it. It's on YouTube. Um, so there's a real barrier there, right? It was so interesting to see that. Um, so if you think about a short man with an extremely tall woman, or a very old woman with an extremely young male partner, that just goes against all of our, you know, ideas about what's normal and what's appropriate and what's okay. And the old woman with a young man, I mean, that brings up feelings of disgust in some people. So let's look at masculinity, puberty, and embodiment. Although height is one aspect, research shows that men also worry about their physical appearance for both functional and aesthetic reasons. The power associated with masculinity is assumed to be rooted in their bodies. The power associated with them, okay? Men, like women, work on their bodies to achieve the ideal masculine physique. And the bodies of boys and men are also judged for their functional purpose, for what they can do with their bodies. Can they lift heavy weights? Can whatever. In school settings, their masculinity and social standing are based in part on physical dexterity, strength, and athleticism. So that makes sports especially important, of course, because they're a way to demonstrate that masculinity and physical dexterity, strength, and athleticism. So masculinity, like femininity, is embodied. Embodiment means it's a social process by which men and women develop their bodies as both objects and agents. Objects to be observed, agents to act, okay? So from this perspective, bodies are not passive objects, but they also don't determine how we experience the world as social beings. We have influence in that, how we experience the social world. Bodily autonomy, here's that word again, autonomy is the ability to make decisions about what happens to our bodies. And it's especially important to trans kids and adult bodies, kids and adults, that their bodies that they have autonomy, because it's a way for them for trans and non-binary people, that they can realize their gender identity by having bodily autonomy. Now, this next section is very interesting and very disturbing, and you may not know about it, but it's also very sad. And it has to do with masculinity and health. And the chapter asks the question, is masculinity bad for your health? Well, the answer is a resounding, oh yes, it is. So let's go on with that was my comment. Let's see what the text says. Because puberty can cause anxiety for both heterosexual and trans boys. So that question, is masculinity bad for men's health in general? Well, one of the most well-known researchers into this subject, Don Sabo, argued that the answer is yes, that traditional ideas of masculinity can pose a real danger to men's health. So as you probably know already, women live longer than men in most societies across the globe. That is even taking into consideration pregnancy and birth. So worldwide, on average, a girl born in 2015 can expect to live to 71, while a boy's life expectancy is 69. That's worldwide, varies drastically between nations and wealth of nations and that type of thing. This gap has widened since 2015 for most of the 20th century, mostly due to the decrease in maternal mortality. So not as many women are dying in childbirth, so that increases the life expectancy for women. Men's higher rates of smoking also contributed to the gap. And more recently, in the US, men's life expectancy was reduced by 2 years as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Globally, now this is globally, the men's death rate from COVID-19 is about 50% higher for men than for women. In the US, the overall death rate for men is 1.6 times the death rate for women, and the gap is the widest for middle-aged men, with 184 deaths to every 100 female deaths. And researchers are still uncertain about why. That's almost twice as many, right? 184 to 100. So if you think about this, what these facts reveal in the differences between, the overall men's and women's health, and they highlight really dramatically the power of gender in our lives. Men all around the world live shorter lives in part, and this is the sad part, because of the choices that they make. And they're not necessarily freely chosen choices, because they're at the affect of advertising and messages about gender just as much as women are. So, like choosing to smoke. Why would men, on the average, be much more likely to smoke than women? Well, and I know you're too old to maybe even know about the Marlboro Man. I'm going to put up an image of the Marlboro Man for you. There were huge advertisements on billboards and in magazines all over the place at a certain period of time. And a real man, smokes Marlboros. And I'm going to share something with you. Interestingly, my father was the photographer for the Marlboro Man advertisements. So you got that. To be a real man, and they were all real men, the Marlboro Man, you got to smoke Marlboros. So obviously, from that example, many forms of or aspects of hegemonic masculinities in the developed world actually encourage risk-taking behaviors in men. In other words, masculinity itself is as important force. The very fact of being masculine and the idea of what it means to be a real man, hegemonic masculinity, is an important force in leading men to take risks with their bodies, more risks with their bodies than women do. For example, morbidity, as opposed to mortality, looks at the prevalence of disease, illness, and injury. So that's not deaths, but the prevalence, the amount of disease, injury, and illness. So considering that, morbidity, not death, women on average are more likely to have chronic illnesses than men do, that don't necessarily lead to death, but sometimes to a difficult and uncomfortable life, diabetes, rheumatism, that type of thing. The area of morbidity in which men exceed women is injuries. So what do smoking and injuries have in common? Both can be risk-taking behaviors. Men are more likely to be injured in their attempts at demonstrating their masculinity in reckless ways, and in playing contact sports like American football, rugby, and boxing, and also in jobs that put them in danger. In research in Australia, working with working class men, there was a high incidence of violence filled with fights, beatings, brawls, assaults, bashings, and sometimes knifings. Let's go back to risk-taking behavior and cultural expectations. Do you know, I'm sure you men do, that men's automobile insurance rates are sometimes double or more than double young men's, and young women's? Why is that? Well, they just do the statistics, right? Young men have, adolescent males and through their 20s, have much higher rates of automobile accidents. It's due to that risk-taking behavior, right? And once they attain an older age, those rates come down. Okay, so what the research demonstrates is an important contradiction about the relationship between many men and their bodies. The sports men play might be dangerous and violent, but at the same time, masculinity encourages to do things that frequently put their bodies in harm, risk of physical harm. Now, if you look at the grim statistics, and they are grim, of homicide and suicide among men, then you really see an example of this. Although women in the U.S. are more likely to attempt suicide, men are much more successful at actually killing themselves. And what's the difference? The difference is how they do it. Women generally use pills, so they're often found, their stomachs are pumped, whatever. And it takes time to die from the injection of pills. But men much more likely to use guns or hang themselves, as opposed to women's more common use of pills. Homicide is the second leading cause of death among men aged 15 to 19 in the U.S. Now, that is an almost unbelievable statistic. Let me say it again. Homicide, murder, is the second leading cause of death of men between 15 and 19 years old in the United States. And just between 15 and 34 years old, men make up half of all homicides in the U.S. They are also disproportionately the perpetrators of homicide. One study found that 95% of homicides in the U.S. were perpetrated by men. How do we understand this or make sense of it? Well, one way is by understanding an essential feature of Anglo-European hegemonic masculinity, the rules of which are, according to your book, no sissy stuff. So that means don't act feminine or associate with anything feminine. Another rule of this masculinity is be sturdy as an oak. Don't show any emotion. Remember, going back to the chapter on friendship, how that important that was. And another rule is give them hell. Exude an attitude of, quote, manly daring and aggression, or go for it, and, quote, take risks. This is one way of defining manhood that could be positive in that it can encourage physical bravery and courage, but of course, it can also pose a great threat to men's lives. The most common way to institutionalize male violence, of course, is through the military and war. And although as it can be seen as a way of controlling men's lives, and it certainly is, lives and bodies, we have to acknowledge that you can also gain prestige during military service and also in surviving. I'm going to stop now, and start a second, probably about 15-minute long video.